Matt, if you want to go ahead and get started, it'll be great. Thank you, Matt.
All right, we're here today to discuss with Chad the response and responsibility of the media during COVID-19. Also, information on who to trust and who we can look to for verifiable and trustworthy information during this time. If you have any questions for Chad or myself, you can put them in the chat section. We will also have a Q&A at the end. So if you want to ask Chad any questions in person yourself, you can wait till the end of this discussion. But as a way to lead in, Chad, it feels like forever ago that we didn't have COVID-19 in the news. It has dominated everybody's life, probably globally, around the world. But in truth, it's been about 3 months since it's been a huge concern for everybody. Can you think back? Can you remember when you first started reporting on COVID-19? Maybe some initial stories that came out before it hit the U.S. and what point did it kind of become real for you?
You're right, Matt. It's really kind of challenging just to even think about how it all started here in the U.S. and how we were planning coverage locally at WKMS. I think it first came about in January when we started reading about the cases in China and the first case in Washington State, which now has later been disputed. A case in California they found that might have been there before it first came out in Washington State. So, but we've been watching it since then. But really, I think I believe early March is when it really reared its head in our part of the country. Our first story that I could recall WKMS producing was on March 9th when a student came back from a study abroad trip. I think a University of Kentucky student came back to Benton and self-isolated for 14 days. And that's when it got real to us here, thinking about how many of our family members may be away or traveling and could have been in an airport or been somewhere where there was an outbreak and now coming back home and how to manage that. So I think early March is when it really kind of ramped up here, and I think it's surpassed everyone's expectations since then.
Yeah, for me, the real, I mean, you heard stories, but you kind of equivocated it to something like the swine flu or West Nile, where it's important to pay attention to, but it's not hitting home. So I think for me, it began to hit home when I heard that colleges were being shut down. I didn't quite catch the gravity until then. Can you remember the reaction in your news studio when things started to get more real?
Yeah, it's interesting whenever you're working with a bunch of news junkies because everybody's always tuned in, and so your entire staff, our entire team at WKMS has been watching it and had been concerned. Many parents, many also with, elderly family members who they're concerned about as well. So there was a significant amount of concern right before, we're licensed to Murray State University. So we were on campus at Murray State, and as soon as we were planning for spring break is when our folks were getting a bit nervous. And that week of spring break is when it first started, cases started popping up more and more in Kentucky. And so, we have all taken it very seriously. And in some cases we might take it be overly cautious, which is not a bad thing, but we might be overly cautious because we are so connected with everything that's been reported.
Pausing from COVID for just a sec, as a groundwork, I don't think a lot of people out there perhaps understand what it takes to put out a news broadcast for you all. So as a groundwork, maybe we need to establish, in a day-to-day, what does it take to put a news broadcast together on the radio, and then we can talk after that about how that was affected by COVID-19. both in what you report and how you report?
For us specifically, we're a regional news organization. So we don't just cover Murray, we don't just cover Paducah, but we cover about 25 to 30 counties, depending on what the biggest news is of the region. And we do it with a relatively small staff. And so our day-to-day operation is one, looking at some of the biggest stories in our region, finding that story that we believe not just appeals to that specific part of our region, but to our entire listening audience. So we'll take maybe a smaller story in one community and dig in a bit more to find out why it would matter or what would make someone in a different part of our region care about that given story. So, we'll survey what we are hearing and what stories we're looking at across the region. Then it becomes sourcing. Who do you talk to? How do you talk to that person? How do you get them to talk to you in the event that it's a controversial story? And that's, sometimes bigger stories take longer to report. So you've got to figure out how to build in the time frame and the deadlines to get that story on the air or get it online to our audience. So you're surveying the content that's available or that you think is news. That's also inherently editorializing, right? So that's where media trust comes in, and you've got to figure out if why we should tell a story to our audience and why should they trust us to tell this story. And so we have to do our due diligence in who we talk to and how do we make sure that story is succinct enough to manage your time, because time is the most valuable commodity out there, right? So we've got to make sure that we tell it deliberately and clearly to everyone. So once you've surveyed the news today, you've made the assignments, then you make the calls, then you hope those people will talk to you. Many people are skeptical of the media, and so it's always a challenge to get people to talk to you on the record. And then their name's going to be associated with that story. So once you get the source to talk to you, then the editing or the scripting and editing comes into play. So you don't just write a story and put it online or on the air. It goes through a pretty rigorous editing process, whether it's including fact checking, also to ensure that the narrative is the right narrative and the story you're telling is the correct story for the issue that you're approaching. That in a nutshell. Once you have those pieces together, once you've edited the story, then it's publication, and that's, for us, it's multimedia publication. It's on air, online, sometimes just digital only. Sometimes it's an expanded radio piece that's not just a short story that you might hear. And you have to determine what story deserves what type of treatment. So lots of different elements go into every single story, and it's not just a simple that's a story, let's write it and produce it. There's more to it.
How much news content is there on WKMS minute wise? I mean, how much do you put out per day?
Local news, I think we're at 8 or 9 newscasts a day, and those are relatively short. They're about 3 to 4 minutes. We also have statewide content during the middle of the day that we contribute to. We have multiple journalism collaboratives, which means we house a reporter at WKMS that reports for the Ohio Valley Resource, which is a 3-state collaborative covering the economic transition of Kentucky, Ohio, and West Virginia. So those stories inherently take a bit longer, but they're bigger stories with a bigger time investment. And we'll produce daily public affairs interviews. They aren't necessarily hard news, but they are more community issue oriented reporting that doesn't involve much, if any, controversy, if that makes sense.
So seemingly overnight, I mean, it felt like overnight, everybody's world was turned upside down by COVID-19, that we had isolation and social distancing rules, new guidelines coming in from the state as to who we could be with, businesses being shut down, people's jobs being put on furlough. How did all this personally affect the journalism department and news reporting through WKMS?
Oh, it's infinitely challenging. Our staffs have family and children as well. So when childcare centers close, you can imagine how do you get reporting done if you also have a small child at home? Also, a lot of idea generation and editing is much better in person than it is remotely. And also, we have student reporters that are Murray State students. They're funded by generous donors to the radio station. So then we have another layer that we have to keep in mind of keeping, one, we keep our goal is to keep all of our staff safe, but we also pay extra attention to keeping our students safe at Murray State University so they have a good experience with WKMS. And also a safe one. So, so those are some issues. We don't do any. We did not do in-person interviews for a period of time. When we received more guidance from the CDC, when we learned about to wear masks in public and that they can be helpful in preventing the spread. Also, we've instilled social distancing tools for our in-person interview now. We have boom microphones as opposed to handheld microphones. And we also just to make sure that we don't endanger our sources and we don't want, obviously, our staff to be endangered either. So that makes it challenging. Also, when everything shuts down, there's less news that's not COVID-19 related. If you think about it, things are closed. There are not events happening that are in some cases the source of news. So you have to get pretty creative. And people don't gather in places where you typically find sources. Journalists do things called person on the street reporting, where they want to get the feedback or the opinion of a normal person, not an elected official, not an expert, but just a regular person walking on the street. Well, when people aren't doing that, it's much harder to get that type of feedback in person. You can do social media call outs, but it's still kind of a different sourcing tool that may not yield the best content. So yes, doing the job of a journalist is pretty challenging right now.
I was going to ask a related question. In my mind, there's been, during the past 3 months, there's been basically three major news stories. Obviously, the first one is COVID-19 and all the tangential stories that come off of that. Secondly is the upcoming presidential election and all the other elections. We're still hearing news about that. And unfortunately, more recently, we've been hearing a lot more about racial tension and racial violence. But other than those three, I haven't heard much news from around the world. Is there more news to be reported, or is it just not there? Is this the global concern?
I am sure that those stories are there, but I think about a lot of watchdog reporting and governmental reporting. Most, if not all, government resources right now are tied up in trying to respond to COVID-19. So even the folks who would typically be the newsmakers of that in those worlds, they're all focused on getting the economy back open. I think there's much more reporting to do on the economic side, but it's just so unknown right now. I mean, you look at just Kentucky alone and the budget hole that's going to occur in the next fiscal year and how that's going to trickle down to school districts, to universities, to state agencies that many people either rely on or use for a number of different resources. I also think that in some cases, we're telling a lot of stories about heroes and people who are doing great things, and I think those are nice pieces to see. But I also think I would like to see more reporting on just the human condition right now, and how most everyone in the country and in Kentucky and in our neighboring states have had their routines disrupted. And just in general, the coping that goes along with a massive change in routine at a massive scale that we haven't seen in really 100 years probably in this country. So globally, I'm still interested in how Brexit's going to proceed. I think we should be keeping an eye on what the coronavirus does to the Brexit proceedings. There's a deadline there. I am interested in how elections will play out in November. It's hard to say that there is a whole lot of other news, like hard news, like reporting. I would call it governmental reporting, or keeping a watchdog on important people, because most everybody's focused on dealing with the coronavirus. I'm sure there will be a lot of after action reports that we'll look into how the money was spent. Was there any fraud that occurred? How do we chase down the fraud? and those types of things. But it's really, really hard because everybody's crystal ball is a little broken right now, I think.
Right.
No one really knows what's coming.
Who do you turn to for news? I mean, you as to report, you have to have as accurate of the information as possible. So, do you turn to the CDC? Do you turn to the WHO? Do you turn to the state government? Who do you look to for compiling your news and your stories and your facts?
I would say all of the above on those things. And then when you find things that don't agree, then you got to dig into where the disagreement is and figure out what the answer is. That might be the source of a story, actually, or what would prompt you to report something. Well, the WHO says this, but the CDC says this. We follow the guidance of the government when it comes to press conferences from the governors of Tennessee, Illinois, and Kentucky, the states that we primarily cover. And then we also listen to local medical officials. Our local health department, and yours too, probably issues releases on at least just infection rates. How many cases are in a given county at a given time or have tested positive. And we wouldn't be doing our due diligence if we didn't see maybe things that get a lot of traction on social media and just investigate them. They may not turn out to be a story, but we at least look into them to see if some of these things are real or should be fact checked. Would it be prudent for us to weigh in on some sort of social media debate to just say, you know what, this is not a story, this is not true, or yes, this is true and it's underreported, and our job is to elevate this to your attention because it's our job to do these things. So it's tough to say that we look at all things, but we should pay attention to as much as we possibly can to base our report to spark reporting.
On a balance, if it were equal and totally balanced, how do you see social media? Is it a blessing or a curse in terms of news reporting?
It's both. It is both. Like this morning, I checked our statistics on our website, and 30% of our website traffic comes through social media. So you got to think about news organizations that rely. We are not primarily relying upon traffic and audience because our business is not primarily advertising driven, but audience does matter. And so to see that if we did not have a social media presence, we wouldn't be considered a player in the media environment or media landscape in far western Kentucky and in our region in general. So it is, I guess, for business, if it's utilized the right way for journalism or for the news business, it's probably pretty good. In terms of misinformation, it's a really bad thing because it can spread very quickly. There are no gatekeepers. Historically, the media has been the gatekeeper, but also the media has changed dramatically over the last 25 to 30 years, where now you see media that have completely lost any level of objectivity. And so when news becomes infotainment, it makes it tough for every other journalist to do their job because they're also just considered the media. So I don't think it's just social media, but I think social media has prompted some of these changes that we see. And when there is an outright competition for eyes and ears from the general public. So, but back to your original question, social media is a blessing and is a curse. You can't dismiss it as one or the other.
So when you're looking with a journalist's eye at social media, how do you determine what's real, what's fake? Do you have tips for the listeners out there as to what they should be looking out for?
Yeah, well, number one, just don't precipitate anything. Be really, really careful about what you choose to share, because it's, if it's something that just seems unbelievable, it probably is. It's just like the too good to be true statement. So obviously look for reputable links that are tied to articles that you might be sharing. Also, don't just share a story without reading it. Like we're all guilty of that. We see a headline and we share it versus reading the story. I can look at the average time somebody spends on a story on our website, and I'm pretty sure they're not spending enough time to read the whole thing, whether or not it gets shares or not. So I think also, if you click through a story and it's an unfamiliar link, click on the about of the website. If it doesn't have an about, number one, then it's probably not a reputable news organization. Also, if there's no author, I think when people don't put their names on reporting, then there's also something you should be concerned about. That means a single person is not willing to stand behind that report. Granted, occasionally you'll see staff reports, and in that case, then maybe the entire staff should be contributing to that story, and that's why a story has the byline of staff report. But again, if a journalist is not willing to stand behind their story by putting their name on it, then you might want to rethink using that story as a primary source for you to base your knowledge, right, or from which to base your knowledge. Also, I think we get in the habit of seeing people sharing screenshots or pictures that have facts that are not facts. Sometimes I consider myself like a truth warrior, if I can be, on occasion with some of my friends on social media. Some blatant things that are not accurate, that are easily, you can easily find multiple articles to support the fact that those are egregious or not true. That's not true information. Then you might consider, depending on how you feel with that person, either sending them a message or suggesting to them that is not a true statement that they have published. Just don't share things blindly. Be a responsible media consumer, I guess. But I could go on for days about that.
Right. Some of our social media platforms, most notably last night it made the news, is our Twitter. With Twitter, they're putting their own fact-checking and restrictions on content, particularly around COVID-19 and the upcoming elections. And Twitter made the news last night for putting some fact-check information as to some comments that President Trump made. Is this social media's job? Are they considered journalism sources now? What are your thoughts on social media and fact-checking?
I think it's tough. I know that, Facebook and Twitter, I know Facebook has employed journalists to be fact checkers for some of their posts that they see that are getting lots of shares or getting a lot of traction. It's important to remember that Facebook and Twitter are just private businesses. They are not, they have their own agenda, right? Whether it's to monetize their services, or to bring people together or to divide people. It depends on what your opinion is of social media, right? Because they need the audience to participate in their software or their platform for them to have enough revenue to operate. So always at the heart of it, you should remember that these things are businesses, in terms of for the social media organizations. Is it their place to stop the spread of misinformation? Probably. However, they have hundreds and hundreds of millions of users. It's, I don't know how you police it. And also, I just think we're living in a world where trust is hard to come by anymore. And, it's going to come down to a person-to-person connection in many cases to explain to someone why something might not be a fact or might not be true. But, that's a really good question. I wish I had the answer. I don't even think the social media organizations have their answers. The businesses have their answers right now. They're trying. I think they're trying to figure out what their role is, from infringing on someone's ability to share their ideas and to prevent the spread of misinformation by wildfire. And I don't, I don't know how they can do it effectively.
Right. Media is in the name of social media, but we don't think of them when we think of the media that people talk about.
Mm-hmm.
They are. They started out as chat rooms essentially, and have evolved into something else. I don't think we all know exactly where they're going to be and what kind of power they will ultimately have. Have you sensed in recent years a growing distrust in media? Do you hear that a lot?
Oh, yes, yes. From my closest of friends and family to listeners and consumers of public radio as well. So yes, very much so. I have noticed though that people tend to trust local media more than national media.
Okay.
And I think, and I'm not sure why that is. It might be because people know the people who work at their local newspaper or local TV or radio station, or they know the people involved in the reporting, you know, whether they know the local mayor or the county judge executive or the commissioners or the school teacher or principal or whomever that's being reported on. I get the sense that I hear more and more that that there is a broad national media conspiracy, right? That there are a few people at the top pulling all the strings to ensure that certain type of reporting is coming out from a given organization. I believe in my heart of hearts that true journalists are really in it for their job as being, is it the fourth estate, right? So where their job is to be a watchdog and to be independent and to report the news, whether it's whether you have to report a pretty bad story on your closest of friends or not, you're going to do your job because you know it's the right thing to do. So I believe that in my heart of hearts, but who says that there are always bad actors out there that can spoil it for everyone. But yes, I do believe, as there are fewer gatekeepers to information, not saying the gatekeepers are a good or bad thing, but as information flows more freely and people can isolate themselves in their own echo chambers, that there's much less trust, I feel, generally.
Right. You could find a quote unquote source for just about anything you believe.
Right.
So how do we know what sources to trust? How do we find that consensus? Or is that the answer, finding consensus?
Well, I think one, media organizations to trust are those that are transparent with their information. You know, try to report out what information you have and how you received it and what you can release. Obviously, there will be sensitive information that journalists cannot release, whether there's a source that could only speak to them anonymously because they either fear for their livelihood, fear for their life, fear for their family's livelihood. And you'll have to make your own decision whether you want to trust a reporting of pieces that have anonymous sources, because inevitably there will need to be some anonymous reporting to really break stories that are important. But you have to trust that organization. Maybe they should all have their ethics posted on their website. WKMS has we follow the Public Media Code of Integrity. You can see that, I believe, a link on our website. But I think the organizations should share that information. They should share how they get the information. And if they don't publish something, why they shouldn't publish it. We're in the world of infinite data right now. So, posting a PDF of some of the documents that you're basing your reporting on, if you feel comfortable doing that, I think the more you can provide people to back up what you're reporting I think it's going to be a necessary part of our job.
That would be then one of the blessings of social media, is being able to post that for all to see. Yeah.
Right. Where our job is to synthesize the information, tell you the story clearly, and connect the dots. But if you want to see that information, and we have no qualms, like if we don't feel as though it could put a source at risk, then you publish it, right? That's why many states have open meetings and open records laws. I think that you have to be careful, just to make sure you protect folks. First, the rule is to do no harm. So you've got to make sure that but yeah, I just tell people what you're reporting, how you receive the information, and hear it and provide them access to that information if they so choose.
Speaking of doing no harm or doing minimal harm, you've probably had to do some very difficult reporting in terms of cases of death surrounding COVID-19, just hard stories to present, not to mention hard stories in the past about local school shootings or that kind of thing. How do you approach a story like that? How do you approach it so that you're providing facts without causing more hurt or causing panic?
That's a really good question. We've had a couple of instances reporting stories like that, either with COVID-19 or, you're right, with a school shooting. I'll give you the example of, for a school shooting, naming the shooter. Many people may have known the name of the shooter at a given school shooting, but our policy was to not release the name until the police confirmed the name of the shooter. We wanted to leave it to that organization because we don't know, in some cases, what the ramifications could be of naming someone like that in the heat of a moment. And we are also very sensitive approaching sources that might be connected to a death of COVID-19 or someone who may have had the actual illness. There's still so much stigma around COVID-19 that in some cases it's hard to get people to want to talk about their experience with that sickness or with the illness. And so we're kind of at the mercy of whether people choose to talk about those things. But if people are being named widely in a given situation, then us wading into that by naming that person doesn't add much to that conversation. So for example, now the governor every night has been naming a person who passed away from COVID-19. He's getting permission from family to do that. And so we air the governor's press conferences. So we are by association airing those names, but we're not going to go chase out anyone who passed away or family members from someone who passed away and try to exploit them to get that information from them. It'll be totally up to the source as to whether or not they want to share their story with us. We're not going to force ourselves upon anyone to tell a story they don't want to tell.
How do you respond to somebody who doesn't trust your organization? Or do you respond to somebody who expresses distrust or just hates WKMS and NPR in general? How do you feed them at all?
If they are unreasonable, then there's no reason to try to conduct a longer conversation with that person. But I'm always open to criticism and critiques because if you've ever had anything edited before, that's, our job is to be a service of the public and to represent the public. And if there are members of the public who have concerns about how our journalists are doing their job, then I would certainly want to hear them and listen to them. Then I would explain to them how the work is done or tell them how the story came about or how the story was reported and see if they have concerns about that process. If there was something they felt that was omitted from the story that should have been in there, why they believe that should be important. And then we would have an editorial discussion about why we decided to do what we did. But no, I'm happy to talk to critics as long as people are reasonable. There are some people that are just outright mean about things, and you can't really deal with just mean people who are lobbing verbal grenades about what you do or what how your organization operates. Right. But people who want to have a reasonable, sensible conversation are actually welcome. I welcome those conversations.
What other kind of feedback do you get from viewers, listeners, besides criticisms? Yeah.
Well, I mean, in many cases, it's people seeking more information. They want to know more about a given story. Or in many cases, we have a lot of national programming from either the BBC or from NPR or other program providers. And so, some people want to know if a story that was discussed on a national report has any local implications. And so that's our job to kind of dig into local representation of a national issue. We get, we do get complaints of bias on both sides. We'll get a complaint that we are too biased towards a given political party on all sides. Sometimes they think we're too friendly to Republicans. Some people think we might be too friendly to Democrats, or certain local governments. A certain county we might favor versus a different county. So, all of those things, which is fine. That's our job. So,
I imagine some of those criticisms just help you take a second look at what you're doing.
Oh yeah. It
Yeah.
also reminds us that people are really paying attention,
Right.
you know, and people really do care about what you're doing. And so when you have the public's trust, or you're attempting to maintain the public's trust, then it's, you know, it's vitally important to make sure that we're not making missteps and owning up to any mistakes. I mean, we're all human. People make mistakes. It's, in some cases, people think a journalist is making a deliberate attempt to be biased by stating something, but in some cases, it's really just a mistake. Like they just forgot a word, or they forgot a sentence, and the editor missed it too, because we're all human. And so you have to give the benefit of the doubt to to human error as well.
We're almost at the 40-minute mark. We've been nice quick chat. Let me just follow up with a couple questions about the future of reporting following COVID-19 here. We've talked about how COVID has changed reporting. Are there going to be lasting changes in the way you report things because of COVID that you foresee?
Oh, we'll just have better context and better perspective. You know, like our reporters are reporting on something that no other reporter has covered in 100 years, right? At this scale.
Right.
And so I think just the knowledge and context that our journalists will have from experiencing this will feed into the questions they ask in the future for just like the very simple story of rainy day funds. Like, who has a rainy day fund? What businesses have enough operating capital to operate for 4 months without needing a government infusion of cash? Well, not many now, but many. Yeah. But in a year and a half, are we going to see businesses be more conservative with their spending and with their savings? So, like, I just think the lexicon is going to change on the questions we ask in terms of everyday business stories or everyday healthcare stories about personal protective equipment, like how much of a stockpile do you need now after something like this? What did we learn? So I think our perspective on our coverage will change, but I don't know that the business of reporting will change hugely, especially when we find ways that to either vaccinate against this or have reasonable treatments to where people don't always have to wear masks or always have to stand 6 feet apart, or, you know, those types of things.
My last question is COVID's going to fade from the news at some point. Whether it deserves to fade from the news or not is a whole nother question. How do you ethically decide when to back off from COVID coverage and put something else at the forefront?
I think one thing is your audience will tell you, not deliberately, but through data and through through data and through fatigue. I mean, right now, I think people already have a news fatigue with COVID-19. I mean, I believe it's evident. WKMS has 3 different services. We have a news service, we have a classical music service, and we have a music service. And I get the sense that we'll see, we will see more listening to music and less listening to news for a while. I just think I think you'll see that. I think data will tell you that in some cases.
Okay. All right. Is there anything else you want to add before we open it up to public questions?
I don't know, not necessarily. I appreciate being asked to do this. I think it's great. I don't necessarily consider myself an expert on sussing out fake news, but I know that just the practices that I employ and that, I suggest people employ are just, do your research. Don't share something blindly. Do additional Googling if you can, look at different fact-checking websites, and you're going to make up your own mind. I mean, that's the great aspect of being a human, is that you have the free will to determine what you want to believe, whether it's true or not, right?
Right. So we'll open up the floor to anybody else who might have questions out there. Looks like we have 11 people participating at this point. You can put your question in the chat, or I think we can ask it out loud as well. So if you have questions, feel free to ask it now.
I'll go first. I have a question.
All right.
So Chad, what would you say is a good way to determine if a source is credible or not? Because a lot of libraries are really, really focused on making sure people get good, credible information.
Mhm.
So how could we explain that to somebody who doesn't necessarily have a background in that?
Are you talking about journalistic information or just like in general, like information, where you're talking about peer-reviewed journals or those types of things?
Um, Either or. I think either of those could be really interesting, and I think people would
Mhm.
be interested in either one.
I think in one of my, I always try to follow the money. That in some cases helps you determine whether or not things are things are coming to you from a slant or with their own agenda. So if you read a news article that quotes a certain foundation or a policy institute or a think tank, go to that think tank's website. Look at their financial reports if you can. Find out what type of, if they are a nonprofit think tank, find out what kind of nonprofit they are. Are they a 501c3? Are they a 501c6? Some of those are outright political organizations that lobby on behalf of different issues. So it takes a little bit of work. And then once you look into their about page, where maybe they'll blatantly say, our job is to further, progressive policy, or our goal is to further conservative policy. Then you'll be able to read the reporting with your own perspective or your own understanding of what that policy institute's goal is to achieve. In terms of just basic news organizations, it's hard to know some of them because they'll have such benign names, and so you got to figure out whether or not their reporting is, if you survey a number of their headlines and a survey a number of stories, you might get the sense of what type of reporting they do, whether they are, left-leaning, right-leaning, whether they're publishing or pushing a certain agenda. So I would say I would dig in as much as you can on whatever source that you're using, just to ensure that if there is a bias, you're aware of it, so you know where they're coming from. And whether you may or may not agree with that bias. And that's fine. But you just need to know, there's a policy institute in Kentucky that we have been at odds in our news coverage, saying, when we cite the organization, when we use their research, is to say they are a left-leaning policy institution. They have pushed us on that and suggest that we are calling them something they are not. But we have made the decision, based on all of their issues that they research and all of the things they find, that they are a left-leaning policy institution. So sometimes the media organization has to step up and just call it what it is. But in some cases, you can't rely on news organizations to do that. So it is really incumbent upon the user to be able to make sure that they're getting information that's credible. I think you just look at it with a skeptical eye, all of it, I think.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions out there?
Chad, this is Bobby. I just want to make a comment. I want to congratulate WKMS. This is their 50th anniversary. Am I not correct?
You are correct. We share a 50th with the library, I think,
Yes.
right? Yes.
How about that?
Yeah. Thank you.
That's a milestone.
Well, we've really appreciated the partnership with the library for many, many years too. And, had it not been for this virus, we probably were going to have some joint events, if I recall. That would have been great.
We were.
Mm-hmm.
If somebody watches this afterward, Chad, what's a way they could get a hold of you to ask you a question if they wanted to?
They can just send me an email. It's Lampe, LAMPE @murraystate.edu. And all of my contact information is on the website at WKMS.org, where you can contact me or the newsroom. But I'm just grateful that to be asked. That I just urge everyone to be as a skeptic when they consume the news. I think it's probably better if you research more than to accept things on face value. Don't just read the headline, read the story. And try not to wade in to a bunch of social media comments. I don't know that they add a lot of value to your experience, but they might. That's kind of my thoughts on it. But you have to weigh evenly on everyone's. Everybody has their own values, their own opinions, their own implicit biases. So we just have to, respect those things, but make sure that you're trying to get the most accurate information possible.
All right. If there's no further questions, I want to thank Chad for his time today. This is the McCracken County Public Library. Thank you all for joining us. Feel free to contact us if you have any questions. And on the library's behalf, thank you all for being here today. Take care.
Thank you.